All right.
go.
All right, thanks. Okay. Yeah, well, thank you for having me, David. I'm happy to talk about some of the work that I've been doing with the Ministry of Natural Resources in Ontario, Canada, looking at bringing together multiple surveys to improve creel estimates. And that's what done with some, the co-authors listed here. And just to note, this is also recently out as a paper in fisheries research. So if people are interested in the details, they can always look it up. So I'm going to focus on Lake Nipissing, which is a really large lake in northern Ontario, which is provincially significant, in part because it has one of the largest recreational fisheries, both winter and open water, as well as it supports a large rights-based commercial fishery as well. And so it's intensively managed, particularly for walleye, yellow perch, some of those species. And for the winter creel, part of the management has been to use roving creels basically for the past 30+ years to gather some of that data. Now, the issue has been over the last 10 or so years that ice conditions have become increasingly unreliable, including much more variable timing of ice on and ice off, and also just fewer safe ice days in general. And this can make it really difficult to actually schedule a roving creel and make sure you're getting enough samples and getting all of your strata. So Nipissing has been really forward-facing, forward-looking in terms of dealing with this. And over the last 4 or 5 years, they've carried out a number of other survey types. So they've done aerial surveys, access creels, parking lot counts, postcard surveys, angler diaries, etc. And as the data sort of rolled in from those things, not surprisingly, you find that different sources of data give you very different answers about questions like effort or catch or harvest. So, of course, we know that partly this is, yeah.
Okay, paramedics there.
Hey, somebody is not on mute. Oh, perfect. All right, take it away.
All right. So of course we know that different survey types have different strengths and weaknesses. Roving surveys give you incomplete trip interviews. Aerial surveys don't have interviews, etc. But it certainly has created the question of, so if we want to move forward and optimize our creel, we want to look at these different types of surveys. How do we even make comparisons within or among years using this data? And there are a couple other specific issues they wanted to address for Nipissing. And one is that it's a walleye lake. Most people are targeting walleyes. And so activity is highest early in the day or later in the afternoon, which means that catch and harvest rates, or at least catch rates, differ significantly depending on when you're actually interviewing people, depending when they are in their trip. And for safety reasons, roving creels tend to be earlier in the day. So they miss some of those high walleye activity times. And the other issue is that there are a subset of huts, about 30% of them are commercially owned and then rented out to the general public. And to access these huts, they don't use public access points, they use private land, which means that access creels don't actually count these commercial huts. And so it's an important part of the effort on the ice that needs to be accounted for. So then looking at this creel optimization problem, one of their objectives was to develop a model which could estimate creel effort, catch, and harvest by incorporating multiple data sources. So that's where we came in, and we developed a Bayesian model, which is the Joint Estimation for Recreational Creels, or JERC model, as I'll refer to it. And here's sort of a conceptual figure of the flow of information. But in general, it follows a similar pattern to most analyses of creel data. So you have survey data representing samples which are being made on particular days. That data, you can extract information on activity, information on trip characteristics for anglers, so trip duration, party size, number of rods, and also catch and harvest based on the identity and numbers of fish being reported. And then these are extrapolated in some way to give you estimates for a full season or some period of time of interest. to give you total effort, catch and harvest rate overall, and then total catch, total harvest. So although it's similar to analyses of Creel data, there are some differences, and I'll just highlight those here. The first is that when we're talking about estimating total daily activity, we're using something called survival model or survival analysis. And what that really means is there's the fundamental question is you go out on your shift as a tech, you count some number of anglers leaving the ice, let's say 5 parties leaving the ice at 11 a.m. The question then is how many parties are on the ice for the full day? Now, one of the ways to get at that would be to use something like an expansion factor or a conversion factor to extrapolate. But in our case, we actually estimate what we're calling a daily activity curve. And so this is a probability density function which represents the probability of an angling party leaving the ice at any given time of day. And this is estimated directly from the data in the model. And one of the nice things is that it's very flexible. So it reflects the actual activity on the ice, which may not be uniform or symmetrical over the day, something which is harder to get at with the expansion coefficient. So we can look, and so for example, the shape of this curve really reflects the fact that it's a walleye lake and that a lot of trips are ending later in the day because of that. So basically, we can extract from this curve the probability of a trip dying or ending, hence survival, at a given time of day, and then convert that into a binomial, which asks for if you observe some number of angling parties leaving, given a full day's total number of angling parties and the probability you have, you can estimate what that big N is. The second is that, again, for the activity module, you don't have to use just one source of survey data. So you can use multiple survey types in combination to estimate effort. So this is on the idea that, so any of these survey types, roving Creel, access Creel, for example, they're still measuring activity in angling parties, right? So they're measuring the same thing underlying. They just have some variation or differences about that. And so we can actually make them comparable by saying that they share this activity curve that we've estimated. And so that we can see our observation taken from our access Creel that some number of parties are leaving at this time gives us a probability that we can convert into an estimate of daily activity. We can do the same thing for the roving party. And because they come from the same curve, we actually can use a joint likelihood to jointly estimate what the daily total effort was. And I'll leave it at that, although I'm happy to answer some questions. And then finally, so the model is modular, which means that data can be mixed and matched. So you can choose to use excess data, for example, for some parts of the model, but not others. And this allows it to be customized based on expert knowledge, that some parts of different survey types are more representative maybe of the fishery than others. So what did this look like for nipissing? So the first question is, if we want to estimate total effort for a season using this model, we need to identify survey types to inform our activity model and to inform our trip model. And so we can do this in JERC. We can create different versions of the model for different combinations of data that are being jointly estimated together. So you can see on the x-axis, you can have a model which represents, which has only the access data, one that has access plus aerial, one that has roving only, roving aerial, roving access. Okay. And so then we can actually ask, what does the total season's effort look like depending on which source of data we use or which type of recreational surveys that we take. And not surprisingly, different survey data types give us different estimates of effort. So we get our lowest estimates come from, for example, the access only data, which we know intuitively is missing those commercial huts, so is going to be lower. And our highest comes from the roving only data. We also get a pretty high estimate of effort from the roving access combination. So first we can ask, so this is great, but how does this compare to the numbers that they've been looking at previously. And so the more standard approach on nipissing has been to use software called FishNet. And so FishNet's estimate of effort for using only the access data is around 100,000 angler hours. And when using roving data with FishNet, it's around 400,000. So pretty widespread. But intuitively, it makes sense that our values are bounded within that. And they're not the same model. So how, for example, how we deal with time is quite different than how FishNet does. So we don't expect the values to be the same, but we can gut check that they're in a reasonable range. So nipissing elected to go forward using both roving and access creels to jointly estimate effort. And there are a couple of reasons for this. So one is, well, why stick with roving at all, since roving is becoming more variable, less reliable. And part of it is because roving does get those commercial huts, which are of great interest for management. The second is that a reminder that when we're estimating effort, trip characteristics also matter. So trip duration, for example. And when you have roving plus access data, you can use the access data to inform trip duration. And the data shows us that because access creels are interviews of completed trips, trip duration is much higher. So it's almost twice as high as what you would get from a roving interview, and more representative of the actual effort that's happening. So let's just bring together strengths of two different data types. And it's also worth noting, although I won't go into very much detail, that what we found was, it's true that roving is variable, that going forward it may become, you may have fewer days in which you can send out a roving crew. But even when there's less roving data available, which is what the x-axis shows, in a jointly estimated model that has roving plus something else, so roving plus access, for example, there's very little impact of losing roving samples on the overall precision of the estimates. So that's a real plus. It's stabilizing to have the joint estimation. Whereas in the case where you have roving only data, uncertainty really increases as you lose data points. So secondly, they can choose, because of the modularity, which data they want to use to inform their catch and harvest model and get the total harvest and total catch estimates. And in this case, they chose the access interviews. And what we see is that estimates of walleye catch rate are about twice as high when we have access interviews. And that's because they're getting completed trips which have sampled more of the day. And we know that as the day goes by, walleye activity is increasing and catch rates are increasing as well. So we feel that this is more representative of the actual catch rates that are being experienced around walleye compared to roving interviews, which tend to occur slightly earlier in the day and earlier in trips and give you a much lower number. And so we'll use the harvest rates as well from the access interviews, but they're pretty similar regardless, which is how it should be. So when you put this together, we can actually compare the jerk model estimates against the standard approach that's being used in the past on nipissing. And so that's 2021 to 2024 here. And what we see is that in blue, these are the standard roving estimates, so they've been relying on these for most decisions. And typically, estimates are much more precise. So in green, when they come from the jerk model, and effort tends to be a slightly lower estimate of effort, which agrees with what we saw before. When it comes to harvest estimates for walleye, what we see is that, again, standard roving estimates are much more uncertain, or at least much less precise, compared to those in green from the jerk model. And then also harvest estimates tend to be slightly higher when they come from the jerk model. It was interesting because this is in agreement with some intuition that walleye harvest rates have been slightly underestimated from the winter recreational fishery in the past. And so this has gone into some thinking about making some changes going forward. So for nipissing, ultimately they identified an optimized creel being one that had both roving and access creels as being the best representation of the fishery. If we, using the jerk model, were able to provide increased precision in the effort and harvest estimates. and also suggested that even if we have fewer roving samples going forward, we can maintain some precision in those estimates, and to account for the known differences in catch and harvest ratios. Ultimately, because we're not using the roving interviews, they've replaced the roving creel with just on-ice activity counts, which has really decreased the amount of labor required. And because we incorporate time into the model in a different way, it's not necessary to have AM, PM strata. So overall, this led to some changes in the design, which looked to be saving about 30% on the winter creel cost. And it's also being applied to a couple of other lakes, including Lake Simcoe. So we'll be interested to see how that works out. With that, I'll just acknowledge and thank the many people who helped out and take questions.
All right, thank you very much. That was a really great talk, and I feel like the people who are attending this meeting is exactly the folks that want to hear about this type of research. I have a question about the Bayesian model, where you said access surveys inform the completed trip time. You said it was a Bayesian model. Did you use any Bayesian priors with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So any parameter that's estimated had priors. The most likely one is, so for those activity curves, so the parameters that describe that, basically that beta distribution, have to be estimated. And we actually sent out people on the ice to count how many people are leaving every hour so we could build really strong priors for what those curves look like. So we did collect data to put together priors for that. And then most of the other priors come from some like past year's data, basically.
That's awesome. I know a lot of people that work with Bayesian models say have uninformative priors and think about how to integrate those two types of surveys. That's really, really great idea. I really loved hearing about what y'all are doing. That's great. And yeah, I'll open the floor to any other questions. And yeah, just raise your hand if you have a question, and if not, we'll turn it over to Natalie. All right, right now we see the team screen.
I think Caroline is still sharing her screen right now.
Oh,
Sorry.
all right, there we go.
Okay, well, thank you, Caroline. Can you guys see my screen okay? Yeah, awesome. Well, we'll get this thing going and stuff, and to build off of Caroline's mixed methods and things, we'll continue with my master's research. My name is Natalie Coash. I'm a cold water research specialist for the Missouri Co-op out of the Columbia, Missouri. And although before I got here, I conducted my master's research at Auburn University with Dr. Matt Catalano, where we evaluated the pros and cons of a black bass tournament fishery here in the Southeast United States. So we'll get this thing going. We're going to cruise through it a little bit. So let's see. Cool. So some quick background. Over the past 40 years, bass tournaments have steadily increased in popularity, and black bass continue to be the most sought after freshwater fish in the United States, bringing in billions of dollars every year. Although there have been some concerns that excessive catch and release angling could be affecting population structure and fishing quality. Unfortunately, tournaments tend to have a higher post-release mortality rate than non-tournament angling, and as tournament fishing has increased, there's been conflict between tournament and non-tournament anglers regarding the proper use of the fishery, increased mortality, and resource crowding. And this isn't something that we're just seeing at these events. This is documented in published literature as well. So despite these concerns, tournament expenditures generate large amounts of state and local tax revenue through gas and food and lodging and tackle. Therefore, tournament anglers continue to contribute higher per trip expenditures than non-tournament anglers. So much that tournaments are making a big difference to economies surrounding reservoirs. Although many Southeast reservoir studies have shown that non-tournament angler effort makes up a large proportion of the fishing effort despite their lower expenditures. And in order to fully quantify the use and economic impact of the fishery, we need to know how tournament and non-tournament bass anglers are responding to tournament activity. And so this is important to consider because there are trade-offs when it comes to utilizing the fishery. Tournament angling has a large economic impact, but it can potentially have negative effects on the fish stock and other stakeholders. Therefore, it's important to consider these questions when evaluating the trade-offs associated with a black bass tournament fishery. So how would non-tournament angler effort respond to changes in tournament effort? How is this going to affect our fishing quality? And how would direct expenditures vary in response to changes in tournament effort? So today we're going to get at these questions by assessing anglers' intended behavioral responses to variable fishing quality and bass tournament effort using a mixed methods survey, as well as we're going to simulate the trade-offs between fishing quality and economic expenditures as a function of angler effort. We want agencies to utilize this information to construct management regulations that maximize the benefits of the tournament fishing industry, as well as support a high quality fishery with desirable catch rates and size structure. So our study system for this project was Neely Henry Reservoir, located in Northeast Alabama. It has a mixed species fishery of largemouth and Alabama bass that attract a high amount of tournament effort relative to the reservoir's size. So in objective 1, I went straight to the bass anglers themselves and assessed their behavioral responses to changes in fishing quality and tournament availability here. I used an access point design to survey anglers at bass tournaments where we'll know they'll be in a concentrated area at a certain time, as well as I used a roving Creel style survey to capture people who may not participate in tournaments as often or at all. I collected information on anglers' tournament, pre-fishing, and non-tournament trips, their hours per trip, their expenditures broken down into several categories, some intended behavior scenarios, and some socioeconomic information. And so this was conducted between March and December of 2023, and I did 2 weekend and 1 weekday survey trips every month for both types of survey techniques, roving and access point. And this is like a 5 to 10 minute abbreviated survey. So let's take a closer look at our intended behavior scenarios. So this was arguably our most important question of the survey. Understanding tournament and non-tournament intended behavior is going to allow us to accurately estimate effort and expenditures and their effect on the population. So we asked anglers about 2 hypothetical scenarios. The first being, how would your fishing trips be affected if you caught double or half the number of 2 to 4 pound bass every fishing trip? We wanted to know if their effort was going to stay the same or by how much their monthly tournament and non-tournament trips would vary in each scenario. So you're going to fish a couple more tournaments or you're not going to come here anymore at all. We also did this same question with how their fishing trips would be affected if there were double or half the number of tournaments at Neely Henry as well. So now that we have anglers' baseline effort and trip expenditures, and we also have an idea of how angler effort might respond to fluctuations in fishing quality and tournament activity, this will lead us into objective 2, where we're going to use this information from the survey to set up our simulation model to understand how fishing quality and expenditures would respond to fluctuations in angler effort. So although I poured my heart and soul into this model for the sake of time, and this is our Creel group, I'm going to gloss over this process and I'd be super happy to elaborate later. But in summary, throughout this project, I varied the amount of tournament and non-tournament angler effort to help us understand how our performance indicators, fishing quality, and angler expenditures would respond through a age-structured simulation model. So let's get into some results. So we collected 223 tournament surveys and 136 non-tournament surveys. I was able to calculate a weighted average to give us a more representative sample of our anglers to make sure that we're accounting for differences in sample size. So based on this weighted average, 58% of anglers indicated that they participated in both tournament and non-tournament bass angling. 34% do not participate in tournaments at all, and 8% only participate in tournament angling. So in short, all socioeconomic data followed suit with previous literature regarding their distance traveled, their time and their money spent fishing. Overall, we saw a lot of variation among our tournament anglers across weekend and weekday surveys, which also aligns with past literature, while non-tournament anglers were pretty consistent across the board. So these were the weighted values that we then applied to our simulation model to help us evaluate the fisheries trade-offs. So now that we know more about the interviews we are analyzing, let's see how this group of anglers responded to our intended behavior scenarios. We're going to assess the 3 scenarios presented to anglers during the survey, which included their current tournament and non-tournament angler effort, as well as their responses to double and half the fishing quality scenarios at the reservoir. So on our x-axis, we have our 3 fishing quality scenarios with their baseline effort in the middle here. And on the y-axis, we have all of our survey's tournament trips, if they participated in tournaments. So this bar plot compares the mean tournament trips of each scenario to their baseline angler effort. This is a pairwise comparison between the baseline angler effort here and each scenario to the side after we ran their survey responses through a linear mixed effects model with a random effect for individual angler. So interviews indicated that they're taking around 30 trips per year, including pre-fishing. And according to our survey, when fishing quality was cut in half, there was a 24% decrease in tournament trips, according to the effort that they said they would respond to in that situation. When fishing quality was doubled, we saw a 52% increase in annual tournament trips. Both of these responses were statistically significant from their baseline. And interestingly, 24% of tournament interviews said that they would leave the system with their tournament effort if the fishing quality got any worse, while non-tournament interviews averaged around 12%. Next, we have the same 3 scenarios across the bottom, but now we're looking at everyone's non-tournament trips. Non-tournament trip is any recreational bass fishing outside of tournaments. Anglers are taking a little less than 30 trips a year, and when fishing quality was cut in half, we saw a 22.5% decrease in their non-tournament trips. When fishing quality doubled, we saw an 81% increase in their non-tournament trips. Both of these were statistically significant from their baseline estimate. And interestingly, 75% of all of our interviews said that an increase in fishing quality would have a positive effect on their non-tournament effort. So next, let's look at how our anglers responded to fluctuations in tournaments on the reservoir. So on the x-axis, we have that same baseline in the middle, but now we have half tournaments on one side and double tournaments on the other side. And we're back to looking at everyone's tournament trips this time. So according to our survey, when tournaments were cut in half, anglers didn't budge much. We're not seeing a huge change from their baseline effort. And they often said, I'm still going to fish my tournaments. And when tournaments were doubled, we see a similar response from anglers. And they often said, there are too many tournaments here already. So what we may be seeing here is there may not be a large demand for additional tournaments in the system, but they still want to fish the amount that they're currently fishing. So there is no statistical significant difference in responses between either of these scenarios, but we may be seeing some biological significance here. Only 16% of all of our interviews indicated a positive effect on their tournament effort if tournaments actually increased. Maybe more importantly, 62% of our interviews said that their tournament effort would not change if there was an increase in tournaments. Lastly, we are now looking at all of our anglers' non-tournament trips to the reservoir with the same x-axis. So when tournaments were cut in half, we saw a 21.5% increase in non-tournament trips. And if tournaments were doubled, we saw a 22.5% decrease in non-tournament trips to the reservoir. And both of these were statistically significant from their baseline effort. So anglers are fishing more non-tournament trips when tournament effort decreases and are decreasing their non-tournament trips when tournament effort is increasing. So this was kind of the relationship we were looking for in this project to quantitatively express this relationship between tournament and non-tournament anglers or trips. And this is what I needed to inform my simulation scenarios. So now that we know how anglers are interacting with each other, I incorporated this relationship into the simulation model and assessed changes in size class abundance and expenditures across several different scenarios and a large elasticity analysis. But for the sake of time, I'm going to highlight some key trade-offs today. There are a lot of really cool relationships that happened in these different scenarios. I would totally be happy to go over those with you guys some other time. But let's start with evaluating our first performance indicator, fishing quality, represented by the abundance of two size classes that tournament anglers like to target, those preferred and memorable size classes. So on the x-axis, I've expanded our 3 survey scenarios into 5 here to broaden out those changes a little bit so they were a little less extreme. On the y-axis, we're looking at the percent change in abundance of preferred and memorable bass compared to the baseline estimate of what was in the reservoir at that time that we surveyed. So what we're seeing here, our take-home messages are what as tournament effort decreased, your abundance of black bass are increasing, and vice versa. We saw that memorable bass, size bass, are more affected than preferred in most scenarios, which is sort of what we would see in a population structure. And what this means is if it normally takes us 1 hour to catch 5 fish, if tournament effort increases by 100%, it's going to take you 20% longer to catch those same 5 fish. Next, I evaluated our second performance indicator, annual direct expenditures across each type of angler effort. So on the X, we have those 5 tournament effort scenarios. And on the Y-axis, we have non-tournament direct expenditures in light gray, tournament direct expenditures in the middle, and our annual total direct expenditures in your darkest bar. So the baseline total direct expenditures for this fishery was estimated about $1.53 million. And when you decrease tournaments by 50%, we see a 19% decrease in annual expenditures, equal to about $300,000 of an annual decrease. When you go the other way and increase tournaments by 100%, total expenditures increased by 47%, a $720,000 annual increase. You can also see that these graphs incorporated the angler relationship we observed in Objective 1. So as tournament effort is increasing here in the middle, we can see our non-tournament effort decreasing. And that kind of is shown in the annual direct expenditures when these non-tournament anglers are leaving the system. Lastly, we can tie everything together and look at how expenditures and fishing quality fluctuate together. So on the x-axis, we have our total annual expenditures, and the y, we have our percent change in abundance in memorable and preferred bass. And we have memorable in black and preferred in white, and they're across those 5 different scenarios here. So what we're seeing here is that the trade-offs are relatively linear. There's not really a sweet spot or a win-win where you can make a lot of money and have really good fishing quality. So managers can look at this and say, okay, if tournaments increase a little bit more, we can circulate around 23% more expenditures around the economy while only seeing a 11 and 5% decrease in black bass fishing quality. Or are we at the point we're going to start losing economic value if the fishery gets any worse? If we cut down by 25% tournament effort, you're only going to lose about 9% of expenditures, but you're only going to get a little better fishing quality. So in summary, angler socioeconomic data aligned with past literature, and tournament effort had an inverse relationship with non-tournament angler effort. And we saw in this system that there was minimal demand for more tournaments. And additionally, angler effort was more sensitive to changes in fishing quality compared to tournament opportunities. For example, 6% of our interviews said that they would leave if tournaments increased, while 20% of interviews would leave if fishing quality declined. So from Objective 2, we saw that economic performance and fishing quality were relatively linear, and memorable bass showed a higher sensitivity to changes in tournament effort compared to preferred. And fishing-related expenditures would have to be sacrificed to improve fishing quality or vice versa, depending on your management goals. And this kind of project led us to questions such as, is a 22% decline in non-tournament effort significant to managers? And what percent reduction or gain in fishing quality and tournament activity is detectable by anglers? So I'd like to acknowledge ADCNR for funding this project and all of my colleagues for helping make this all happen. And I appreciate you guys for giving me the opportunity to be here. With that, I'll take any questions.
Awesome. Great photo. And Paul's got a question. Let him take it.
Thank you. I might not be thinking about this correctly, but I'm thinking about the non-tournament anglers, and you ask them if they would fish more or less, depending on tournaments, right? And if they said that they would fish more, let's say that no tournaments, I'd fish twice as much, then you're going to double effort. Does the model factor in that you might have more anglers being attracted to the fishery? So it's not just the anglers that are existing are fishing more, but there's also going to be more coming, which would even be higher effort.
Absolutely, that's a great question. So the model does take into account the non-tournament anglers coming back into the system. And I also actually ran a scenario where some managers and some tournament anglers don't want to think that tournaments affect non-tournament anglers at all. So I actually ran a whole scenario where non-tournament effort was not even affected by tournament effort along that gradient. And you can see how the fishing quality and expenditures change in that scenario, which was actually pretty interesting. But going with surveys and things, this simulation model does not include any anglers that would come back to the system if there was a tournament, if there was a decrease in tournaments over time. So we could not, figure out how to have that dynamic side to it to take into account the anglers that could possibly come back to the system if there was a decrease in tournaments.
Yeah, because I mean, who do you survey? Right?
Yeah, we can't survey the people that aren't there and stuff, but that is totally valid. That is absolutely something that we have thought about.
Really cool study. Thanks.
Thank you.
I got a question. I noticed that what I got from seeing how new tournament effort is affected by perceived tournament effort. It's kind of it didn't change much from the baseline and it wasn't significantly different. Do you think there's almost like a carrying capacity for each lake for how many tournaments can exist and for anglers to fish comfortably? Because I remember you said like there's already too many tournaments on there everywhere. That's just what I hear that a lot at Creel surveys as well, and I'm just wondering if you had a thought similar to that.
I had absolutely the same experience, and yeah, I absolutely believe Neely Henry is a pretty small lake. It's way smaller than Guntersville, but very close to Guntersville. That is a way bigger system that attracts way more anglers and things, and their Neely Henry is absolutely can possibly be at the carrying capacity. And that's kind of what I got from the tournament anglers. Most of the time when I was in these tournament interviews, they wanted less. They truly wanted less, especially if that gave them better fishing quality, because any of the anglers, if you talk to them at Neely Henry or any of ADCNR that manages there, like it's a tough fishery for sure. So it was super interesting to find that conclusion coming out of, seeing in the graphs and kind of matching that with what we saw in the field.
Yeah, it's really interesting questions. What do managers care about, fishing quality or economics? And what about the legislative bodies, that the government agencies, what do they care about most too? It's a really interesting question. I love this study.
Absolutely. I did my best to try and, stay neutral. It's fantastic to see the economic value add to these small communities, especially in Alabama and things. But yeah, it just depends. I tried to stay neutral in the sense of providing this thesis, and I'm working on publishing right now. Providing this in a sense for managers to weigh those pros and cons of what they want. And I'm actually expanding those 5 scenarios into another 2 more to get a little bit more minute changes, because 50% or 100% increase in tournament is a huge jump compared to what we could adjust for and see what could be more logical on a finer scale for management agencies.
Awesome. Well, when you get that paper published, pass it along to me and we'll show it to everyone in this group.
Yes, sir.
And
thank you guys.
Yeah, let's move along. Michael, you can share your screen whenever you're ready.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Yeah, and don't worry too much about time. We'll just eat into the extra time that I have at the end. Just try to keep it around 20 minutes, and we'll just as close as you get is fine.
Uh, can you see it now?
It looks like it's in presenter mode. Oh, yep. Perfect.
All good.
All good.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for everybody being here, and thanks for inviting us to come and talk about some of my master's work. I'm excited to present it. Before I get into anything, I just want to thank all the people that made this possible. So, the University of North Dakota Biology Department for all the support and everything throughout my master's, the North Dakota Game and Fish Department for providing the funding and allowing me to do the work, and then my lab, the underwater lab. So I don't think it's lost on anybody on this call that the vast majority of conservation efforts in the United States are conducted and supported by these state natural resource agencies, just like North Dakota Game and Fish Department. But what might be maybe less understood or less realized is that the support of that natural resource agency, the state natural resource agency, is primarily built on a foundation of license sales. The vast majority of a state natural resources funding is built on those voluntary contributions by individuals. That funding mechanism is really those license sales. And so just like anything else in natural resources, we as managers track, quantify, and monitor those license sales over the years so that we can make sure that they're at an adequate level and we can actually perform the conservation efforts and do conservation like we usually do. However, what we do is we track and quantify these license sales at this community or population level. And I think we all know that that's kind of inappropriate in traditional fisheries management, because if we want to make any management actions and see what's actually happening in the community, you really need this population level, this underlying population level dynamics, which might reveal a much different story that's masked by those total population or community level trends. So here you can see that we've got two underlying population level subgroups of license sales that are fluctuating, that were masked by that overall total tracking of license sales. And many state natural resource agencies have already recognized this need and devised methods to try and quantify, track, and understand license sales at that population level and not that total community level. And so if you're familiar with the R3 movement, the recruit, reactivate, and retain movement, to sort of get more recreationists back out there in the outdoors recreating, they've developed those methodologies to categorize individuals based on their license purchasing histories. And so I'm going to give just a very brief overview of those contemporary methods used by R3 professionals today. So they sort of disparately categorize anglers and other recreationists into three groups based on these definitions. Like a retained angler is an individual who purchased a license in the immediate previous year. Or reactivated anglers are individuals that did not purchase a license in the previous year, but purchased a license in the previous 2 years. Or like a recruited angler is an individual that did not purchase a license in the previous 2 years. But these contemporary methods really have some pretty stark limitations. So just to start with, they're rigid and sort of static definitions. Anglers and other recreationists are forced into these three disparate groups when other groups might be out there. Other patterns may be out there in the population that aren't being captured by these contemporary methods, these definitions. They're forced into those three categories: the retained, reactivated, and recruited recreationists. The definitions, these contemporary methods, they're only capturing a really short duration of an entire individual's license purchasing history. So this only makes use of the last 3 years, and we know that compounded over multiple years can introduce a massive amount of variation into an individual's license purchasing history. The definitions are subjective and they're inconsistent among the states. So what might be a definition for a retained angler in Montana is not the same as the definition for a retained angler in North Dakota, and so on and so forth for the other groups, which makes it nearly impossible to compare these metrics across the states. And I do want to recognize that some people have addressed this already. I think Southwick has done some work on that, but primarily they're subjective and they are fairly inconsistent among the states. And then lastly, these contemporary methods, these definitions, they really ignore the license types, which might introduce some inference into what the dynamics and the behavioral attributes of recreationists. So it doesn't take into account whether an individual buys that regular sort of base entry level, I think most states it's like between $12 and $18 fishing license, or if an individual bought the most expensive combination license and all the stamps and anything else going on with it. They just really don't capture that variation. They just primarily ignore the license type. And so it only evaluates whether or not they bought one or they didn't. And so that was really the objective of our study, was to identify angler typologies, which are those groups of individuals with similar license purchasing histories, using a robust quantitative and objective method that really addresses all those limitations of the contemporary methods to categorize individuals based on license purchasing histories. And so to address that throughout our research, we stumbled upon the sequence analysis. So sequence analysis was originally used for DNA sequencing until it was adapted by Abbott in 1995 for the social sciences. And throughout this whole process, when I was conducting the sequence analysis, doing it and everything, I really used this book by Richard and Studer. It's a textbook on sequence analysis and some other sort of more sociological approaches to some of these things. And this was really my guiding research for the sequence analysis. But if anybody on this call or anybody is ever interested in replicating some of this work, like the sequence analysis, I'd really just encourage you to reach out. And my email is on the screen now. I've already done this work with the North Dakota stuff, and I'm more than happy to share any expertise or any information that I have that would help if you are interested in replicating the sequence analysis at all. But now getting into just the nuts and bolts of what sequence analysis really is. Sequence analysis, we start with that angler license purchasing history, right? Where we've got all the years that individuals could have purchased a license on the x-axis, and then each individual angler on the y-axis. And then the years that they bought a license, as well as that license type, what license type they bought in each year. What sequence analysis is trying to do is it's trying to find those groups of individuals, those typologies with shared license purchasing histories. And it's based on 3 metrics: the sequencing, the timing, and the duration. And I'll get into that in just a moment. But mathematically, what a sequence analysis is it's a pairwise comparison of every single individual in the license purchasing database. And what it's trying to do is it's trying to turn X1's license purchasing history into X2 based on those 3 metrics: the sequencing, the timing, and the duration. So it tries to turn X1 into X2, and then X1 into X3, and so on for the rest of the database. Calculates a cost matrix, and then it's basically like a clustering algorithm that separates those groups based on those distinct license purchasing histories that it identifies. So getting into those 3 metrics, the sequencing is the actual order of the states. So the order in which you see those distinct license types appear throughout the entire license purchasing history. So for here, you can see that X1 has that regular resident fishing license appear in the 4th year, whereas X2 has that regular resident fishing license appear in the 5th year. The timing is when an individual switches between states. So it's kind of the time between those years, right? So you can see that X1 switches between none and that regular license between 3 and 4. and X2 switches between no license and a regular license between year 4 and 5. And then finally, the duration is the length of time an individual will maintain and stay within the same constant state. So you can see that X1's got a duration of 3 for no license type bought, and then X2 is a duration of 4. And so based on those 3 metrics, the sequencing, the timing, and the duration, it calculates that cost matrix by, turning one into another. So here you can see that like the first 2 rows, X1 and X2, had a low cost to turn, X1's license purchasing history into X2, but X1 had a high cost to turn it into, say, like X5's license purchasing history. So it clusters it out based on those 3 metrics, the sequencing, timing, and duration. And that's how you get your angler license typologies. They're similar groups. They're groups of similar license purchasing histories. Okay, so just some additional methodology before I move on. We used only North Dakota resident anglers, which accounted for about 285,000 individuals. We used the years 2009 through 2019, and then to actually do the sequence analysis, we used the R package Treminar, and that's the citation there too. So getting into some results now, these are the 2 main plots that you get when you do a sequence analysis for angler license typology 1. When you do this, you can basically visualize 2 different levels, this individual level, which is the index plot, and then the population level, which is the distribution plot. And that's the population of typology 1, which is I'm messing up the verbiage here a little bit, but it's the subpopulation within the entire North Dakota angler population. So I'm going to walk you guys through the graphs here. On the y-axis for the distribution plot, this is the proportion of the license type that was purchased within 2009. So you can see that most individuals within typology 1 did not buy a license, and those that did bought that regular resident fishing license in that like brown color. On the index plot, this represents the same thing, but the y-axis is each individual angler. So the rows are actually the complete license purchasing history of every individual that was sorted into typology 1. So again, it's going to show you the same thing, but most individuals didn't buy a license, represented by that gray color, and then those that did bought that regular resident fishing license. And then I'm going to step forward to 2010, and you're going to be able to see, if you track along in the index plot, you're going to be able to see what license was purchased in the next year. So I want you to pay attention to that brown bar at the bottom of the index plot, and you'll see what license type they bought in the immediate following year. So in 2010, you can see that those individuals that bought the regular resident fishing license, that brown bar, did not buy a license in 2010. However, there are individuals that did buy a license in 2010, that regular resident fishing license, but they really didn't buy a license in the previous year. Hopefully you can see my cursor, but these individuals didn't buy a license in the immediate previous year in 2009. When you look at the distribution plot, you can see that most individuals in 2010 did not buy a license, and those that did, they bought that regular resident fishing license. Again, I'm going to step forward, and I want you to track along in that index plot with those 2 brown bars to get another year's worth of their license purchasing history. So you can see that these individuals in 2009 that bought a license, that didn't buy in 2010, again, did not buy a license in 2011. These 2010 individuals that bought a license in 2010 didn't buy in 2009, didn't buy in 2011. But then these individuals in 2011 bought a license, but they didn't buy in 2010 or 2009. Again, in the distribution plot, you can see that most individuals did not buy a license, and those that did bought a regular resident fishing license. Now I'm going to show you the whole graph, and you're going to get a really broad sense of every single one of those metrics, the sequencing, timing, and the duration, as well as what dynamics are actually going on within angler typology 1. So if you look at the index plot here, you can see that most individuals in typology 1 are not buying a license. They basically don't buy a license. They buy one in a single year, and then they pretty much never buy again. When you look at the distribution plot, it kind of confirms that most individuals are not buying a license, but when they do buy a license, they primarily buy that regular resident fishing license. So it appears that typology 1 is very infrequently purchasing licenses, and they have this affinity towards that regular resident fishing license type. These are the index plots and the distribution plot for angler typology 2. And you can see in the index plot, they're buying a license more frequently than typology 1. But when you look at the distribution plot, they're not having any sort of affinity towards a single license type. They're really split between the combination license, the resident license, the married license, and the senior license. And then finally, for typology 3, you can see in the index plot, they're buying a license like every single year. They're buying a license extremely frequently. And then in the distribution plot, you can see that they are almost always buying that combination hunting and fishing license, regardless of the year. So I'm going to summarize that really quick because I know that was a lot of information and those plots are really dense. But we identified 3 disparate angler license typologies in North Dakota. Typology 1 was primarily characterized as infrequently purchasing a license. When they did buy a license, like once every 10 years, maybe twice every 10 years, they primarily bought that $18 base level entry regular resident fishing license. Typology 2 was buying a license more frequently than typology 1, but they didn't have any sort of affinity towards a single license type. They really split between the combination, the resident fishing, the married, and the senior license. And then finally, typology 3 was very frequently buying a license. They bought a license almost every single year. And when they did buy a license, they almost always bought that combination hunting and fishing license, the most expensive license type in North Dakota. It's like $52. And so now that we have this robust, objective, and quantitative methodology to categorize anglers that can capture as many typologies as is present in the data, we really want to ask ourselves what these typologies, what sort of data these typologies can be linked to better manage our systems and reach our management objectives. So some commonly collected information that's already maintained within these angler licensed databases are things like sociodemographic characteristics, so age and rurality. Another thing these could be linked to are those on-site Creel surveys that we just saw 2 phenomenal presentations prior to this, right? If we started linking this up with on-site Creel surveys or the annual, like yearly surveys that most state agencies do, we might start being able to infer how these typologies are interacting with each other and behaving and interacting with the resources on site. And then finally, identifying these recreational pathways, how these individuals got into recreational fishing and what's really influencing these license purchasing dynamics. I don't think anybody has any doubts, or at least I hope not, that these typologies, license purchasing histories are very different. And that really begs the question, why? Well, it might be how they got into recreational fishing and how they've sustained and that facilitation of continued participation in recreational fishing has happened. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions if anybody has any.
Great presentation. That's awesome. I love that you introduced it as typology 1, 2, and 3 instead of the name that kind of gives it away with infrequent, intermediate, and frequent. And yeah, I'm just learning about typologies with human dimensions stuff, and I'm actually trying to apply a lot of that to some of the survey work I'm doing right now. And I thought this was a great example of using a quantitative approach to answer a qualitative question. And yeah, you did a really great job.
Thank you.
I'm wondering what Natalie thinks about this. If tournament effort would affect those, or maybe those frequent anglers? Are those your tournament people? But also, this is, of course, trout fishing, so it's a totally different beast from bass
Yeah,
fishing.
actually, it's not. Do you mind cutting the share, David? I can't. I'm not as familiar with Teams. I don't know if you can override the share and like cut it or not. But
You should be able to look at the top of your screen,
oh, there
and
we go.
there you go. But
Yeah, there you
I
go.
was gonna add, I cut out a graph that characterizes all of my data based on the amount of their total fishing effort that is tournaments, and you see these huge divisions between anglers. It's either like 90 to 100% tournament effort, or like 0% effort, or like you have those in between that are kind of your combo, your mixed. And totally past literature has characterized that people with different tendencies like this will respond to surveys differently. So I thought that was super interesting.
Yeah, it looks
Awesome.
like Nick asked a question in the chat. I'll try and answer it as quick as possible. I think you're asking, he asked if how licenses are issued in North Dakota and the time frame. They're all on the same year, so basically, I don't know, they all get issued, I think, April 1st, and then they expire March 31st, if that's what you're asking, Nick. I'm not entirely sure. Yeah, okay,
Awesome.
sweet.
I think when you got into the socioeconomic factors, or even things we can measure like fishing quality or tournament effort, I think those would be interesting if you could fit them into your model as priors. I don't know if that sequence analysis you could run it in a Bayesian model. It, and I thought it was nice that you stopped at 2019, because 2020 was totally crazy for fishing license sales. It was the convenient stop.
Yeah, yeah, that was we wanted to get a handle on what was like considered normal before we go
Mhm.
into something something that's crazy. But you know, my master's is done now, and we have looked at that data a little bit, and um it doesn't appear that it doesn't appear that 2020 affected the typologies. Like it didn't create a new
Oh, nice.
typology or um, anything like that. It just kind of lifted the total.
Did you see an increase in those infrequent higher typologies?
I don't
That's
remember off
what
the top of my head.
we're hearing. That's what I've heard anecdotally, is that there's a lot of people entering fishery that hadn't been there before because of lockdown restrictions.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't remember off the top of my head, but you know, we didn't do because it wasn't a part of the thesis or anything, but um yeah, I don't remember off the top of my head.
Nice. Well, yeah, we'll move into the next part. Just gonna keep this brief. Just wanted to give y'all, I guess, a little picture into what happened with the last meeting. I really apologize for uh, not getting out ahead and letting everyone know that we had to reschedule. But yeah, I've been, as a lot of y'all know, I'm also a PhD student, so I'm working hard to juggle the responsibilities of this committee as well with that. And uh, I'm, I just got to a point where it was a breaking point for me. And, but I, I got the help I needed, and I'm thinking much clearer now. And yeah, and also a lot of that has to do with getting this chip here. And if you want to ask me about it, and you're in Hawaii, come see me, and we'll talk about how I got it and what it means. But basically, I just wanted to talk about some of our plans for the future of the Angler Survey Committee and give you all a little snapshot into what we have planned for the business meeting in Honolulu. And a lot of y'all saw the proposal that we're working on to start essentially kickstart the process of working with AFS and also our partners in the fishery management section, fishery administration section, and also we're looking to explore some options with the education section too. As far as developing a second edition to angler survey methods, and I think most people on this call are familiar with that book. It's the Creel Bible. And I was really curious with some of the work that Scott Bonar has been doing with standardizing other fisheries independent surveying. When I saw that, I was thinking, well, what about creel surveys? Shouldn't there be some sort of book out there that wasn't published 30 years ago? And in a conversation I had with Kevin Pope about his conversation with Scott Bonar was, well, creel surveys are surveying people. They're not surveying fish. So it's in that human dimensions realm it's different than the typical gillnet or electrofishing surveys that we do. And also, it deserves a whole book by itself. And I think a lot of people who are familiar with Angler Survey Methods, the first edition, it's time to get the ball rolling with the second edition. And so I'm working on the initial proposal to get some funding, just get us kickstarted and get the ball rolling with planning a conference that gets a lot of the people on this call and a lot of the people that are from this call gets them all in the same room, and we start talking about what's important to include and not include, and what has already been published before. And I see in the conversations I've had with other management agencies, I see the need for this, and we really want to start moving towards getting that published. So we see in that proposal, and if you're interested in taking a look at the proposal or being a part of the team that's working on this, feel free to reach out. I'm going to put my email in the chat. And so we see this as a three-pronged plan, with first developing some sort of symposium that's totally devoted to creel surveys and related angler surveys. And then following that, we want to identify authors for chapters with that, and identify interest in being a part of the author team that's going to eventually develop the second edition to Angler Survey Methods. So that's the second goal, is to ultimately get that published. And in the meantime, we also see a need for something else. And I'm going to share my screen right here. So so a lot of those that are familiar with my research know that I work with the CreelCat team. It's a USGS project where we now have a database that houses a lot of the creel survey data that y'all as biologists and scientists in the field have collected. And we, with this, we're trying to strengthen the connections between management agencies that are essentially asking the same questions and try to improve communication. But every management agency has their own secret recipe for a Creel survey. And that was really great that we got those talks today that showed all the mixed methods with access methods, roving methods, and offsite methods. And there's biases when we make comparisons between these methods. And so what we want to develop is a replicable survey template that's also flexible enough to where it can adapt to one of these methods and also adapt to the needs of a management agency. And the way that we're doing this is also chapter 3 of my dissertation. So I've already contacted a lot of folks on this call to start the North American Creel program evaluation. And it's pretty heavily inland fisheries, but we're also in conversations with NOAA to learn about their MRAP program. And essentially what we want to do is characterize what are the essential components of established Creel programs. And then from that, we see that there's a lot of different ways that survey designs are used to get the metrics that are needed. And so our plan is so far we've conducted interviews with 11 agencies. When I have a little bit more time to devote to this research, we're hoping that we can get that number around 30 to 40 established programs. And we want to identify the important components of Creel surveys and ultimately develop a survey design protocol that's flexible. And we want to publish this. And this is for this community of practice. So essentially thinking about those management agencies that may not have the funding that other agencies have to hire a biometrician. And so publish this paper with reproducible R code and ultimately come up with a common Creel survey template. And I want all three of those goals that we ultimately have for the committee to all be linked together and thinking of them as the one common goal of optimizing and innovating Creel surveys that are conducted by management agencies. So that's just a little snapshot into what we have planned. I guess in maybe a 1, 2, 5 years into the future as we continue to work with this committee and establish it as a standing committee in a place where the Creel survey, where people can come to for Creel survey expertise. And I loved all three of the talks today. It was so cool thinking about how each of those things connect to each other and how research in North Dakota and Canada and also in Alabama are also similar. And with that, I just wanted to let y'all know what we're up to. And if anybody is going to Honolulu, we're going to talk more about it at the business meeting. And with that, thanks everyone for tuning in, and feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about what we talked about today. And I'll see y'all either in Honolulu or at the next webinar. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Dave, and thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank
See
you.
you there.